Ladies and gentlemen, hello and thank you for coming. It's 1 o'clock, so welcome to an MGAA market briefing with regard to the escape of water, which according to the ABI is at the priority of their database these days, and obviously one can see why, because this is the type of year that we get it. Before I, before I actually introduce Ian, a couple of house rules, please. Mobile phones, please do tweet. We're here, but of course do put them on silent, because anybody whose phone goes off, I'll charge them £20 because I'm a director of the insurance charities. Think that I won't. Our chairman last time had to pay £20. So mobile phones, that's fine. We will actually be podcasting this. Teresa has turned us on. So when you have your questions at the end of the session, can you please raise your hand and we'll get the mic to you, so that those who can't join us today will be able to hear what the question is, and then Ian will give you a really good answer. First of all, guys, thank you for sponsoring the lunch. That's very good. There will be a little bit more lunch outside, so we'll probably finish just before 2 o'clock. So Ian, Lynn and the team will be here for any questions you want to have on a one-to-one outside, just to finish off the sandwiches and the drinks. I understand there is no fire alarm. If there is, one of our directors, Jeff, is on the end there. Just watch him go up the escalator, and we'll follow him very rapidly. I'm sure it'll be fine, and we'll just meet across the other side of the road. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again once for coming. It's my great honour to introduce Ian, who's a chartered building surveyor, which is great, but he's got a lot of experience within the surveying, the building, also the insurance sector, and he's both been a project manager as well as a manager in general with regard to insurance environment. So he's looked at subsidence, he's looked at fire, flood, and of course the escape of water, which is the topic of today's thing. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Ian Suckett.
Thank you, Peter. I'll stand up here if that's okay. It's a bit strange to sit here with the screen behind me. So, firstly, thank you to the MGAA Association. I know all your members really appreciate the work that you're doing, representing them and being an advocate on their behalf. Peter and Teresa, who've organised today, so thank you for that. So today I'm just going to do probably 45 minutes. We'll just run through some slides. There'll be plenty of time at the end for questions. But as this is a sort of CPD, sort of briefing type thing, time-honoured tradition, we'll start out with what the objectives are for today. So understanding what's driving the increase of escape of water costs, understanding what can be influenced at a claim level and a slightly wider level, what strategies can we reduce claim costs, and how can data, which is a big buzzword in the industry at the minute, how can that influence future claims, and then whether or not there are any other sort of long-term solutions to the escape of water challenge that may not actually sit directly within the insurance industry but may sit adjacent to that, but to the industry's benefit. So, who in the room, just show of hands, who is sort of really concerned about escape of water claims and costs in their day-to-day sort of working environment? Yeah, pretty much everybody. These numbers are taken from the ABI. It's related largely to domestic costs of escape of water, taken from 2016-17 figures. But £2.5 million a day insurers are paying out for domestic escape of water claims. It's 21% of domestic claims, which I think is just about the most common peril nowadays. £654 million worth of total costs in 2017. And the thing that's really got everybody jittery is the final figure, which is costs are increasing at 31% over the prior 3 years. That's against the background inflation, which is significantly lower than that. So what's driving that, and why is that having such a big impact? Well, we've already had reports from various insurers that it's directly impacting on their bottom line. It's referenced in annual accounts from at least 2 major insurers. We, as adjusters and claims handlers, are seeing a lot of noise pushed down the line from our clients about escape of water and increasing costs. And that led us to consider sort of throughout 2017 and into 2018 what we might do in terms of responding to that. So we established a small research group who used our own data, looked across the market, and really looked to determine and influence and speak to what our response was going to be. There is a copy of the Escape of Water white paper knocking around outside for those who are interested, which is the outcome of that research. But it highlighted a number of areas that we wanted to look at. In essence, and this is some of the stuff that we found from the research, so 76% of the UK housing stock predates 1979. So all of that is already 40 years old. That's 76 of our housing stock pre-40 years old. Of the new homes that have been built, 98% of them report a defect within the first 6 months, and 25% of them report 16 or more defects. So there's a quality issue with what we're building currently. 27% of new homes are timber framed. I'll explain why that's relevant in a little while. And then the other bits at the end, these three next boxes are the ones that are really relevant. So in 1970, only 65% of houses had a washing machine directly plumbed into the property. It is now 97%. Dishwashers between 94 and 2016, it's increased to 45%. And central heating, again, to 95%. So pretty much every house that you go into nowadays has a number of sources of plumbed-in water that are all available to go wrong and cause an escape of water. The other thing that's impacting costs is there's been a significant growth in multi-occupancy dwellings being developed. You go to any of the major regional cities, you're seeing big residential blocks being put up for students, just residential flat leases, and also in the residential and retirement care sector. And escape of water in a multi-occupancy environment tends to be much more expensive than in a normal single dwelling situation. So in looking at the causes, we identified 4 key sectors that are contributing to the increase in costs. The housing market, construction trends, lifestyle trends, and then finally what is the insurance market and industry doing to itself that might be impacting the costs. So the housing market, as I referenced before, we've seen a significant increase in the multi-occupancy dwellings, an ageing housing stock, which is leading to a considerable undersupply and overdemand of property for people to live in. As a result, it's become economically more viable for people to rent their property, so people who do have the means to invest in property are doing so and then using that as an investment vehicle via renting. The cost of moving, particularly in around the south east, is preventing people from moving house. And as a result, people are investing money in their own property. So people are not investing just in property to then make a commercial revenue from. They're investing in their own properties. And whereas in the past people would move house to upgrade, to get an extra bedroom, to get a bit more living space, people are having loft conversions done, having extensions put on. They're even having, basement extensions, which is very prevalent in the London market, all of which adds extra rooms to properties. But often incorporated within that is a lot of work that includes wet perils. So that brings us more to construction trends. So all those extensions and house renovations and what have you are almost certainly having plastic push-fit plumbing put into them. It's a marvellous thing. It's easy to install. It can be literally plumbing for idiots. I can do it, so it must be fairly straightforward. But there is one little bit in there that if you just get it slightly wrong, you're causing a big potential problem for the future. And it's as simple as, in the end of each piece of plastic pipe that you push into a connecting joint, you need to have a stiffening piece. Now, if you're a plumber on site and you're doing, hundreds of metres of this stuff every day, and new developments and old developments, it's really simple to miss that piece that you stick in the end of the pipe before you push it into the joint. You push it into the joint, it'll create a temporary seal. 6 months later, that seal goes, and you've got gallons and gallons of water flooding out your house. So we know that pipes are a significant problem, and they are actually the source of the greatest, most expensive number of claims that we'll deal with in the escape of water space. We'll also see increase in the bottom left-hand corner, so that's an underfloor heating system. There's 2 types of system there. There's the electric system and the water-fed system. Water-fed systems, if they go wrong for obvious reasons, they're a concern. That pours water out. If it's an electric-based system, but you have an escape of water from elsewhere, it becomes a much more expensive repair because you've got an electric underfloor heating system to fix. To compound that stuff is often laid under solid tiled floors. Solid tile floors 20 years ago, if you had an old property that might have an old quarry tile floor and you might have a tiled floor, most properties at the time would have just had a fairly standard suspended timber floor with maybe a linoleum vinyl or a carpet finish. Now we're seeing lots of tiling, lots of wood flooring like that, and lots of different variations of wood flooring, everything from laminate through to engineered oak, through to bamboo bespoke flooring. We've also seen a lot of increased tiling in bathrooms and kitchens, not just floors. So looking around the room, a good proportion of you will remember kitchens and bathrooms from the 80s and 90s. Bathrooms, it'd be 2 rows of tiles across the top of the bath, 2 rows of tiles behind the sink, and pretty much the same in kitchens. Nowadays, if you go into any modern bathroom, there's at least one full wall of tiling, if not all 4 walls of tiling, and the floor. Kitchens likewise. So there's much more material there that if it gets wet, and more importantly with tiling, if it gets wet behind them, become unsafe, have to be replaced, and are much more expensive. Sorry, just to touch on the timber framing issue as well. So we're seeing more timber frame properties built. It's a fantastic, quick, cheap, easy way to build a property. And as long as it's built properly, it's great at keeping water out. The problem is when water escapes and leaks internally, whereas with a traditional built brick and block or brick and brick and plaster, that stuff's hard and largely impervious, and you know more or less where the water's gone. In timber frame buildings, which have lots of cavities, lots of insulation in them, water can go all over the place, and suddenly you find yourself with very significant costs associated with those repairs, especially if it's a significant size of leak. So lifestyle trends, some of these are a little bit linked to the ones we've looked at previously. I've referenced the home improvement thing, I've referenced the extra tiling in the bathrooms. What is absolutely true is that people are investing much more in their bathrooms and kitchens than they ever have done in the past. This is partly because of the stay in one place and invest mentality that's present in the housing market, but also because people just see nicer stuff all the time. Any aspirational DIY show you see on TV, it's a nice bathroom, it's a nice kitchen. There's been a significant move towards kitchen dining experiences. So if you do have an escape of water from your kitchen, it tends to involve a much bigger area, because it now might involve a dining area. Invariably, you've got the same type of flooring throughout. So instead of having a small 3-metre square patch of flooring in a kitchen to deal with, you've now got a 15 square metre patch of flooring in a kitchen diner space to do. We've seen the growth of utility rooms and downstairs toilets and facilities. Again, more opportunity for water to leak. And something that's becoming more prevalent and maybe doesn't actually play out in the figures that we've seen so far around escape of water costs is the integrated home. Now, in the future, that may well actually be a significant benefit to the industry in avoiding and minimising escape of water, and we'll come to that in a little while. But right now, if you have an escape of water, so for example, Philips do a smart lighting set. It's £180 for a little controller and 3 light bulbs. If you have an escape of water that impacts those 3 light bulbs, you've got a £180 repair instead of £4 a bulb from DIY down the road. So there is a potential impact there in the future. We don't know how that will play out over time, but the more integrated houses get, it's all run off electricity, which doesn't react very well to water. So again, potentially we may see some increasing costs in that sector in the future. And then the insurance sector. So, what is some of the stuff that we've done to ourselves? So, certainly from a loss adjusting and claims handling perspective, insurance has become very the claims response has become very process driven and procurement driven. So, over a period of time, insurers have looked to procure different elements of the claims process independently. So mechanical drying and restoration is procured independently. We'll have asbestos removal procured independently. We'll then have claims handling procured independently. And that's all within the same journey of getting a property repaired, which is effectively what we're trying to get to here, or a means for a settlement with the customer. And what that has done over time is, it's meant that the claim is dealt with in a linear fashion rather than as a single entity. That makes claims longer. The more parties you have involved, the more room you have for mistakes to happen, time to build, and that starts to cause some problems. Mechanical drying is something that has probably really come to the fore, I would guess, probably since the 2008 flooding, 2007 floodings, whole Gloucestershire, that sort of area. In the past, the response to a fairly small escape of water would be to take away some of the damp material, open a window, provide ventilation, allow it to dry. Pretty much every claim nowadays will involve some form of mechanical drying. You're probably starting with £1,000 worth of extra cost that wouldn't have been in the claim just by going through that process of getting mechanical drying involved. It also may then be compounded by the fact that you generate further strip out, which then generates further repairs and what have you. And that very procurement-driven approach has also invariably driven down price from a supplier point of view. So I think it would be fair to acknowledge that in doing so, there's then maybe a slightly less qualified person going out to deal with a claim. Things are done a bit more quickly, and it's just not the same level of focus that it might have been in the past. Now, in terms of fulfilment, which we've got there, that really refers to the fact that certainly in the domestic space and increasingly in the commercial space, the insured very rarely actually presents their own claim to an insurer anymore. It doesn't happen that, you know, Mrs. Smith has an escape of water, goes to a local builder, gets a quote, and then speaks to her insurance company to recover the money or to obtain the money to pay for the work to be done. Because of the customer service thing and the customer expectation, insurers will now bend over backwards to help the customer throughout the journey, which is a great thing. You know, as a customer, that's exactly what you want. But from the insurer's perspective, that means that they are then generating and building the claim themselves. And that, linked with the other stuff that they do around the process and what have you, probably leads to a slightly more expensive repair. Again, because it's being procurement driven, you get lots of different rates for different elements, and that is all feeding costs into what in the past might have just been a very simple, here's a quote, negotiate a discount and away you go sort of situation. In terms of customer expectation, we're all aware of the modern world where everything is at your fingertips now. You can order a parcel from Amazon. Within 20 minutes of ordering it, you know that it's been dispatched, you know exactly where it is on the lorry, and you know exactly when it's going to arrive at your property. Customers are starting to expect that in every single aspect of life. And when you're dealing with insurance claims, that's no different. But it does actually make dealing with them much harder, and you may then have to escalate things, which again layers in some cost into the system. The other bit that we find in there in terms of customer expectations is the typical example where it really hits home and incurs costs is around alternative accommodation. People don't expect to be inconvenienced anymore, so people will expect to be moved out of their house into a hotel for a period of time or a temporary rental accommodation, quite often for things that don't actually, in terms of the policy, render the property uninhabitable. So again, you're layering in extra costs there based on a customer expectation. And the final thing that we've seen there is the impact of rulings by the FOS. So most policies will have a matching items clause in there. Most insurers over time have moved away from a strict liability approach. And now there are some very clear guidance from the FOS where insurers will tend to contribute 50% towards a matching items across a sample of damaged items. It's probably best illustrated with an example. So we've got a claim fairly recently. It's a bit of escape of water to a kitchen. The simple, easiest way to resolve that claim was to replace 3 doors on this kitchen. They just got a bit wet and they popped. The replacement cost of those doors is about £128. The customer complained and the insurer agreed to do a matching items on all of the doors in the kitchen. They spent £500 instead of £128. And that's happening across kitchens, tiles, bathrooms throughout the claim cycle. So in terms of looking at the problem and how to approach escalating costs, it's important to understand, what certainly from a claim perspective can we influence. What are the other areas that maybe as an industry we can exert some influence on, but certainly from a claims perspective it's much more harder to. So we certainly can't influence those on as you look at it, the right-hand side. But in terms of the things that we can do, the procurement strategy, how we go about adjusting losses, identifying recovery of third parties. So we spoke earlier about the business with modern plumbing. If that's been installed incorrectly, and you can illustrate that it's been installed incorrectly, there is a route obviously for recovery against that party. Fraud. Now there is a number that is quoted from the ABI occasionally. I think around 33% of escape of water claims having a fraudulent element to it. I don't think that's pure fraud in the way that we would necessarily understand it, but I think in terms of overinflation of the claim, I think there is certainly a significant element of that. And then where you do feel that there is something significant in terms of, somebody who went out and deliberately left it out running or whatever, identifying that is a key thing. And that's not so much about limiting claim costs, but it's certainly about recovering and protecting insurers from that money. Underwriting, I'm sure there is some things that can be done in the underwriting space to limit exposure more than anything else to the cost that may then occur. And then the customer expectation management, that's really the core skill of the people handling the claims, whether it's somebody, a claims handler from a desk or whatever, just managing that expectation is absolutely key. So, having established what we thought the problems were, where some of the actions might be to resolve, we developed our own solution to that. Now, I'll keep this in generic terms because I know this is not a Crawford sales pitch, so we'll just run through some of the things that we considered in the approach that we took. Everybody know these guys? Does everybody know what them and Sir David Brailsford are famous for? Well, apart from cycling and little brown Jiffy envelopes that aren't traceable, it's marginal gains, isn't it? I would guess everybody in the room has heard about marginal gains, and that's the sort of the art of. Their aim is the same as every other cycling team. It's to get the rider across the line first, but it's how do you go about that? So it is just the concept of thinking differently about everything you do, and this is the sort of the view that we took when we considered our approach to escape of water claims. We looked at the key factors, identified those. The right people with the right knowledge, absolutely fundamental. We'll talk a little bit in a moment about what we did with that. Practical training for the people dealing with those claims. We think it is such a specialist area that it should be dealt with as standalone peril. So in the mid-90s, we saw a change in the way subsidence claims were dealt with. It moved very much from an adjuster-led model with an external engineer doing all the technical stuff to an engineer or surveyor-led model tacking in the appropriate adjusting skills where required. We think escape of water is very much the same, and the nature of the claims are such that 75 to 80% of the costs sit in the building repair, so we want the building experts looking at those. We think it's important to invest in the right equipment. I spoke earlier about the delineated process where there's a drying company turns up, an adjuster and so on and so forth. If the adjuster has the right tools to make the decisions, or whoever responds first to the claim has those tools with them, then they can set it off on the right path rather than waiting a little while for somebody else to come and make the same assessment. And that speaks to the next point really, which is about getting out and addressing the damage as quickly as possible. The longer water is present in a property, the more it will impact the materials and the worse it will be in terms of your costs in the scope. Now, the strict handling mandate, that talks to the bit that I was referencing earlier about the insurer's approach to matching items and things like that. It's, how strict on the liability does the insurer or the carrier want to be? But it's a representation of how we think these claims should be handled. And it's a manual with that. We can set the dial on some of that for the insurers or the carrier's expectation appropriately, but the core of that is about how we think claims should be dealt with. I've referenced fraudulent activity, identifying those. One of the things that we think is really important, we've got this delineated approach. That means that they're all experts in their individual bit, and we think having in-house expertise to be able to challenge some of their findings is really important. I hesitate to say that people are want to over-exaggerate their bit of the claim process, but we find by having the right people reviewing their activity and their outputs and what have you at the right time, we can find significant savings in that space. We think it's really important in terms of where we are scoping repairs for those to be line by line, so every single repair has a proper detailed schedule. It's not the traditional builder's quote of repair one house, £20,000. It is broken down line by line in each individual room. And that's important because that feeds into the bit about the data later. So by doing that and having that in a manageable way that you can then draw information from can also help influence your approach to similar sort of claims in the future. Recoveries we've spoken about. And then the key thing is absolutely being relentless in monitoring this stuff day after day after day, taking the small learnings, making the small changes, and just driving those marginal gains throughout. So I won't belabor this. Our solution, so we landed on a hand-picked team, our most experienced adjusters with the most building knowledge. It was determined that actually a chartered surveyor was best to lead this stuff, which is why I was sort of then became involved in the escape of water team. With the right training, given the right tools to do the job, given dedicated support, so the adjuster is only one person with lots of noise around them, having a dedicated person or two at the back of that really supporting them and helping them through the claims is fundamental. I've referenced the specialists in the background to allow us to challenge costs as they occur. And the other bit is using a clear process. So, you know, we know, or we feel that we know, the best response to an escape of water claim, and we will be absolutely relentless in doing that time after time after time, and then learning from that each time, and then seeing whether there's any innovations and driving the right results. So these are just a couple of photos. So with our teams, and this sort of comes to having the right person responding to the claim. We took about, over a period of time, about 60 adjusters out, gave them on-site training with a national building contractor, actually set up some mock kitchens with them, poured water into the different elements of it, showed them how they respond. So when they are actually sat in somebody's house or flat or building, they can see how the water's going to react and provide the appropriate response. That was backed up with some classroom learning on the building side, and then some formal training and testing around that as well to make sure that we got the right people there. So data, probably everybody's favourite subject at the minute. What is the relevant data that we want to capture? Where can we get it from? How is it going to inform what we're going to do in the future? And how might that, you know, play into future claims spend and what have you? So we know there's public data out there: Environment Agency, Land Registry, the census, there's satellite and mapping imagery published, and we know that there are people out there using that data on either a pre-risk or a pre-visit basis to inform whoever's responding to that claim in a significant way, in a helpful way. We've also got claim-related data, so companies like ourselves will gather the data and store it, and then they'll use business analytics to use that to inform how we respond. And that goes down to age and type of property, location, everything down to where the source of the escape of water is. Different rooms have different outcomes. Who'd think the kitchen would generate the most expensive, a leak in the kitchen would generate the most expensive escape of water claim? No? Bathrooms? Bathrooms? Yeah, okay. Utility room? In reality, it's the lounge, which is a bit counterintuitive, and it's only relevant in that it's an unusual place where you get the most expensive claims from. And that's probably because it happens on a central heating pipe and it's out of sight and nobody gets it, and you end up with resultant dry rot or something like that. And it's a low-frequency claim. That's what the data can tell you. And then if you look at the more common threads of kitchens and bathrooms and pipeworks, you suddenly realise, well, that might not be your most expensive claim, it's your most frequent increase in costs, and that's actually where you need to focus your time. And then there's the line-by-line repair data, which, again, speaks a little bit to what I was just saying there about where the costs are. So this is just taken from a sample of claims that we've run through a specific scheduling package. There's another layer behind this, so we can actually get down into the actual number of square metres of plastering we've done and emulsion paint and all sorts of things like that. But we find in terms of the skilled hours, so that's significant because the cost of labour is probably the most expensive bit that we pick up when we're repairing something in the different sectors. So I'm not sure that it's terribly surprising that decorating is the most used number of hours because, you know, in any escape of water, there's always likely to be an element of painting going on. Flooring, it's quite a labour-intensive thing to do, and so on. And actually, kitchens and bathrooms, which in themselves are quite expensive items, the labour costs are not so high. But then when you look at the material costs, so we've just ranked that 1 to 10 there. What is interesting is that flooring in this sample actually spent twice as much in terms of the repair as the next highest one, which was kitchen, which was pretty much on a par with decorating, and then they start reducing down in a significant order from there. So, you know, speaking earlier about the lifestyle trends and the construction trends of having continuous flooring throughout buildings, more open plan living and what have you, that's where a significant amount of the claim spend is coming from. And once you've got that data, as an insurer, you can then determine, well, do I need to do something in terms of global agreements with flooring suppliers? Do I need to do something with kitchen suppliers? Do I need to ask questions at point of cover about what type of flooring they have in the property and where? Another factor that might feed into underwriting type issues. Somebody's phone ring there. Oh, a £20 donation for you there, Peter.
Thank you very much.
I lost my train of thought now. Sorry, yes. Other things that might influence underwriting. So we're seeing a movement of having boilers in lofts and things like that. You know, traditionally you'd have a boiler in a ground floor space, understairs cupboard, something like that. If a boiler leaks there, it doesn't really do a lot of damage. It's not expensive to fix. If when you get into the loft and your boiler leaks, it's throughout your entire house and it's a big loss. So again, you know, the data will start to inform the right questions to be asking at an underwriting level when you're incepting a policy, and it might not be the traditional risk factors that insurers might have looked at. And that will be interesting to see how that sort of develops as more and more data is available in this sector. So in terms of alternative solutions, so I've spoken about the sort of very day-to-day stuff that we can do in a sort of claims handling process. I've spoken a little bit about how underwriting decisions might change and questions might change. But what are the sort of, you know, if anybody had a magic bullet to solve escape of water for the future, what would it be? Well, there's a couple of potential sources for this. That's not a terribly clear image, but so that's the building regulations, that's a leak safe, and that's a smart home representation, and that's a Google Home Hub or something. So the things in here really are all linked to modern technology. So there are already products available on the market, leak safe being one, Waterlock being another. I'm not sponsored by either of those two companies, I hasten to add, that are a physical prevention tool that will automatically shut your water down when flow rates exceed a certain amount or other factors come into play. You can actually get to a stage where you get a notification on your phone that there's unexpected water use in your property. If you know your house is vacant during the day and you get that notification, you can press a button, automatically shut the stopcock off. You won't have prevented your escape of water, but you'll very much have minimised it because it will only be the water that's in your pipes that gets to escape rather than pouring it out. You know, the other thing around building regulations, and it's something that I'm really surprised that the industry aren't doing more of, a simple change in the building regulations for any new build to have one of those self closing mechanisms in place when they build it, it's not, as I say, it's not going to solve your escape of water problem, but it's going to massively diminish it in the future. And they could do that on every new build really simply, and they could also extend that to any extension or work to a plumbing system would then require that to be done. The challenge that we have in that space is, where do insurers and carriers, what is the benefit to them of paying some extra money for a preventative measure on a policy that may then pass to somebody else in the future? Well, the answer is it's generally fairly limited. But if the entire industry took the same view over a period of time, you'd do significant help to prevent those claims in the future. And that's about it. Any questions?
Thank you, Ian. Excellent. So you've heard it here first. There's a call on the government to actually ensure that they pass a law to make sure all new buildings and conversions have this particular system in it, because we're very short of water. Ladies and gentlemen, the floor's open. Any questions, please? Okay, I'm going to throw one while you're thinking of some. Thank you for that. You mentioned, Ian, smart meters. And there are within certain sectors, namely the people like Jeff and I are getting on in years, by installing systems in the home where people can actually monitor what's going on. What it was interesting was the report I was reading not so long ago was that a lot of these people were pensioners and they lived on their own. They just go down the local library and log on to see what's going on in their home, which was really quite interesting, because I thought, you know, big brother in the room, not going to like it. They absolutely loved it. But of course, the question there is that you did say it's not going to stop it, but surely if it's there and you haven't got prevention of water loss, but you've got the situation where most leaks don't suddenly happen, do they? They start to drip, they start to show things. Can you see smart meters developing to actually start to pick that up as we go forward?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. First and foremost, there's an awful lot of water usage isn't metered in the UK. So, you know, people pay water rates and we don't meter water. I don't know that water meters are linked into smart meters at this point. I know electricity and gas is. But, you know, if it is, yes. I think the difficulty comes is you need to know, if you're going to do that properly, you need to know what the baseline use is. Once it's established that over a period of time, that's fine. If during that period you have an ongoing leak somewhere that you're not aware of, it's not going to help you. But certainly if you've got a baseline number and flow of litres of water per hour or per minute, if that spikes and you're not in a property, you know, there's options where it should be, you know, if it's linked into an automatic stop tap, it can shut the water flow off at the time. And yeah, I can absolutely see that coming. You know, a lot of people use smart meters at the moment. I mean, the typical thing is, you know, how much electricity am I using? Can I set the thermostat for the home so it's right when I get home? It's lifestyle improving things. It's not prevention at this point in time, but I'm pretty sure that over a period of time it will move that way.
Thank you. Jeff, you got a question?
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to ask, you've mentioned there's a 31% increase in the average claim cost. What does it stand up at now?
Currently?
Yeah.
Well, I don't have any more recent figures than that. I know...
No, as an actual pound amount.
I think it was 654 million, is that the...
No, per claim.
Oh, per claim. It's around £7,000 per claim.
And with all the, from your own experience, based on all the restructuring that you've done within your own business, what percentage do you think that will save, or has saved?
Well, we are. It's difficult because establishing an exact baseline is quite hard. At the minute, we're in the domestic sector. We're seeing savings against claimed value of around 39%. We're seeing average claim savings down by between 15 and 20%, depends on the profile of work. It's a bit tricky because the profile of work changes. Insurers are doing slightly more themselves. There's alternative means of dealing with lower value claims, so we're naturally getting a higher value claim through the door. But even in that background and that environment, we're showing average claim savings.
Jeff does actually raise a very interesting point, because one of the problems, I think, with the higher quality homes insurance, the high net worth, is to seek and find. And quite often that's an exclusion.
Yeah.
So, you know, that can actually also add, can't it, to the actual cost when you've got to dig up the floor to try and find where the leak is, because it never finds its instant time, does it? It finds its natural course.
And there are, and this is where technology can help, so there are things that you can do to do non-intrusive investigations. Thermal imaging is a good one. There's various companies out there who are very good at that. But, you know, trace and access didn't really exist in policies in the past, and the customer would be expected to find that for themselves and solve the problem. The minute you've got a trace and access claim, A, you're more likely to find a leak. You've incurred the cost of finding the leak. You're probably going to end up fixing it as a mitigating action rather than passing that charge on to the insured. And then you've maybe disturbed more fabric than you needed to, and you've got a bigger claim at the end of it. So it's another thing that's changed in the way the industry behaves.
Any questions from the floor? Yes, one there.
Just a quickie. You mentioned about experts and accelerated drying. I mean, that's not always not the experts, but the drying itself can itself be a problem, can't it? If it's you know, it can cause extra problems.
Yeah, I mean, and I wouldn't want to overstate this actually. Used in the right setting, mechanical drying is absolutely the right thing to do. I think it's maybe used too frequently when there's alternative methods. But you do have to be careful, particularly, you know, if you're in an environment like this that had an escape of water, you'd have to be very, very careful how you started drying out all this timber and these fine pitch and all the rest of it, because it can lead to extra damage. The area where there's most risk actually in that is there's this accelerated, very heat-intensive drying. You've got to be very careful of the existing structure of the building that you're trying to dry with that environment. Timber responds very badly to sudden changes in moisture content, for example, and you need to be very careful of that. The other thing that I would say is that gets missed is there's a lot of innovation in the drying space, and a lot of it is very good. If you're trying to dry something with the minimum amount of disruption because you've got potentially a high business interruption case associated with that, that's absolutely fine. So injection drying with a concrete slab or something like that, where you can leave a machine running rather than having to disturb the fabric, that's perfectly legitimate. The problem is that sort of technology is then creeping into claims where there's no rationale. You might be paying £125 a square metre for that, when actually lifting up and replacing the floor slab might only cost you £8 a square metre. And that's where having the expert with the knowledge in the background to challenge that, we think, is so important.
Thank you. Yes, one right at the back, Teresa.
Must be trouble, it's on the back row.
Everything you've spoken about is UK specific, is that correct?
Yes, largely.
Do you have any sort of information about sort of international markets, either issues or trends that you've seen or heard of that could apply to the UK and vice versa?
No, I don't. What I would say is that if you've got any sort of built environment that is similar to the UK, you're likely to be experiencing the similar sort of things. You know, inflation and wage costs are pretty much the same everywhere. You do get some variance in building material types. You know, America, for example, has an awful lot of timber frame buildings there, which are less robust. But no, I don't have any particular.
But wouldn't you also get potentially a claim for the loss of the water itself? Because obviously, you've already mentioned not everybody's metered here, but of course in Europe it tends to be more so.
Yeah. In fairness, it's not something that we see a great deal of. Is a claim for the loss of the water itself. It's certainly not in my experience. But yeah, in where you get more metered water, or in environments where that's the norm, then yeah.
Any more questions? Okay, we'll bring this session to a close. Would you please show your appreciation to Ian for the excellent presentation?